Hi, I'm Joshua Barnes, and I'm joined by Al Shalloway. And today's 5 minute short is: can MBIs, minimum business increments, be used with Scrum and Kanban? So, the minimum business increment is where we're identifying the next smallest thing that we can do that provides value to a customer. Now, it's not at such a small level like a single story, right? A single user story that we might do that is going to, you know, enhance or improve a capability or a feature we already have, out in our, in our product that customers are using. That's not what the MBI is. So, Al, can you explain how MBIs can be used with a Scrum approach or a Kanban approach?
Yeah. Let me make clear about one other thing with the MBI. The full definition would be the smallest releasable increment of value that's consumable by the customer, so they get value, as well as makes sense for the business, because there is a transaction cost here, and the transaction cost can either be being paid by the customer in terms of having to relearn things, or by the business because actually getting it out in the field may take people offline or things like that. So we've had in our past MBIs where we could have released it, the customer could have consumed it, but it wasn't worth the transaction cost. So we want to keep that in mind. Now, in thinking about this, can MBI use of Scrum and Kanban? I've actually thought a more generic rule that I want to mention first, and then we'll talk about, they can. But I would suggest that if you have practices or concepts that can't be used everywhere else, they could be useful. The other place might deny that they could be used. But if they would be useful, then there's something wrong with what you're doing. If you, on the other hand, have a method that a good practice can't come in and be used, there's something wrong with your method as well. This idea that some things are to certain practices comes from the fact that Scrum, Kanban, XP, these all came up with a set of practices that you use. Some, like Kanban, are closer to lean practices. But the MBI comes from the notions of lean and flow, and are somewhat agnostic to any approach. And when you come from lean flow theory of constraints, those approaches, artifacts, whatever, can be used anywhere. And that's a good test. Can your practices be used anywhere? I mean, where it's appropriate.
Yeah.
And can you accept any other practice? And if either of those are wrong, there's something off. So basically, Scrum and Kanban would benefit greatly by using these. Scrum and Kanban now mostly have to do this through an indirect method. So like Scrum, you think of the sprint backlog, what we're going to do over the sprint plan, and we've kind of many people put their stories and features together, and then you have, I can release. So of course you can release in the middle of a sprint, but you should actually be planning for that release, because then you plan to get it as soon as possible. Very often I see that things would be releasable, but people haven't thought about it that way. They're like working on the features and stories, and then, we could release this, let's release it now, instead of saying, what can we do that would be releasable in the middle of the sprint, and then what we can do next. Plan for that flow, because then you focus on that. Also, when you create your MBIs, you tend to not fill out the stories and features underneath them as much as you would otherwise, because you only need to create stories and features that are going to help support the MBI. Sometimes there's stuff in a feature I need for a second MBI or later on. The MBI guides you to have thinner stories and features so you can get things done sooner. Same thing with Kanban. Kanban may be, and there is a distinction. Kanban based directly on lean is more of a kind of a flow and pull model. The Kanban method, as espoused by Kanban University, is actually a transition model. How do I do things in small steps and things of that nature? It could definitely be used in either of those types of Kanban. Kanban method is often done in like little steps, as I mentioned, the Kaizen approach. MBIs may or may not be consistent with, if somebody's really, we only do Kaizen and stuff like that, because MBIs might cause a big jump in change. But you could definitely do it, and you should have a conversation. Kanban method, as far as I know, doesn't preclude anything, even if it's not totally consistent with Kaizen. But again, this is the thing to look for. This is the interesting thing about, actually, I guess, the difference between DA and also my own Amplio methods and the work I know Joshua does. What we've done is we've gone down to the roots of what works, the lean flow theory of constraints, and then we pull up practices that work for your situation. Frameworks typically are a collection of practices that you're trying to provide. So you have greater flexibility in the approach of coming from the science and the universal principles and seeing how to apply them. MBIs are based around universal principles about what's to be built, how to get it out there, look at the transaction costs, and who needs to do it. Hope you found this useful. Anything you want to add, Joshua?
No, just other than to keep in mind those transaction costs, and also how we, sometimes hear, oh, well, yes, with using Scrum, we can release in the middle of a sprint. But if you're doing that all the time, then maybe you're not planning, or maybe you're not looking at something from a little bit larger of a perspective, because it sounds like, oh my gosh, we found something we can release. And then like a couple minutes later, we found something we can release. That's not necessary. That sounds a bit ad hoc-ish to me. And oftentimes when I see that happening, there's just lack of planning. So thanks everyone for watching this either live on the replay. Leave any questions you have in the comments, and we'll get back to you. Thanks.